Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Malcolm Renfrew Interdisciplinary Colloquium for Tuesday, April 26, 2022. This is going to be the last in-class, in-person presentation for the spring semester. And in just a minute, I will introduce the panelists. But before I do so, I have a couple of other events going on that would like to share with you. First, this Thursday, we have what we call a Renfrew bonus event sponsored by the College of Agricultural and Life Sciences. It's called Sounding the Depths, Exploring Soil Stories. For students enrolled in IMTR 450, this would count in place of one of the regular Tuesday events. It's 4:30 on Thursday in room 106 of the Ag Science Building. It will include refreshments, musical performance, and a panel discussion featuring you'll recognize one name here. So we'll have Zach Kaler, Mike Strickland, Jen Ladino, Chris Foon from the School of Music, Russ Mafe, and Elle Danzinger. So put that on your calendars for Thursday. And regular subscribers to the Renfrew Colloquium email list will receive an announcement on that later today. Next week, we will be outdoors, fingers crossed, across Nez Perce Drive at the University Arboretum and Botanical Garden. Paul Warnick, the horticulturalist, will lead a tour. We'll begin at the Nez Perce Drive entrance, which is near the golf course parking lot. And if you could plan to be there a little bit before 12:30, and you'll see me and Paul Warnick, a few others to get started. Paul has indicated that we probably will not see the lilacs and the flowering crab apples that we did on our last Arboretum tour, which was 6 years ago in 2016. But he did indicate that we will see probably some flowering cherries and magnolias and maybe some early crab apples flowering next week. So please come along for an experiential visit to the Arboretum. We are also calling for proposals for fall programs and hoping to receive nominations and self-nominations by Friday, May 6th. You can send them to me at kbird.uidaho.edu. We welcome proposals from interdisciplinary teams that would include faculty, postdocs, graduate students, visiting scholars, and maybe a team of graduate, undergraduate, and faculty. We'll be resuming again on Tuesday, August 30th. So would be delighted to hear proposals from anyone in the audience today. And we're always looking for the opportunity to visit interesting places on campus. Labs, libraries, archives, studios. So if you have suggestions, please let us know. So that brings us to today's program. We will have 5 presenters. 3 of them are participating remotely, and 2 are here in the classroom in the admin building today. We're going to hear Stories of Fire, the Confluence Lab, and Narrative Science Communication. And so I will stop my share and turn it over to Jen Ladino to kick things off. So thank you, Jen, for helping put the program together.
Sure, thanks for inviting us, Kenton. It's my pleasure. I will do the screen sharing here, and Teresa is actually going to go first and tell everyone a bit about the project.
Okay. Thank you, Kenton, for the introduction. Can you hear me okay? Perfect. Okay. And Jen, thanks for the screen sharing here. So, and thanks again for the warm welcome. So today we thought as the Confluence Lab that we talk to you a little bit about some of the interdisciplinary work that we're doing around storytelling. And we're really focusing on two aspects of storytelling that we want to share with you this afternoon. And the first one is participant storytelling. So in these science communication spaces, like say a ranger program at a national park, not necessarily what are the people in front sharing in terms of storytelling, but what do the audience members, what do the participants bring to that situation, right? What are the stories that they are telling? So we're calling that participant storytelling, and we'll talk about that first. The second part of storytelling that we'll talk about, and this is from Erin and Jen a little bit later, is scientist storytelling. So in these same science communication spaces, what are the stories that scientists have, and how can they be telling those stories more effectively? So I'll start here with the Stories of Fire project. So this is a project that's now 2 years old, pilot project funded by the National Science Foundation, Advancing Informal STEM Learning program. And we are really interested here in dialogues, creating spaces of dialogue in science communication spaces about living with increasing fire in the American West. And as per Confluence Lab and the way in which that we work, this is a really interdisciplinary team interested in storytelling. So Lita Kobziar, who's a fire ecologist, Jen and Erin from the English department. I'm a science communicator and geographer. And then our students are housed in the environmental science program, Kayla Bordelon and Jack Kredell. You'll hear from both of them this afternoon. No switch, Jen, thank you. And these are the spaces in which we're working in, right? So they are national parks, state parks, and environmental education centers. And as you'll see in the picture to my left, these are spaces that are pretty typically a person standing in front and delivering information, scientific information in this case. And what we're interested in doing is shifting this space, right? So it looks more like the space on the right, where one of our graduate students here, Jenny, is really listening to the stories of audience members, right? And co-creating the knowledge that happens in the program. And go ahead, Jen, and switch to the next one. I should say we're interested in two things about that particular space, both the meaning making of fire that people are bringing to that space, and then also how we really can make that space most productive. What's the structure that works best in programming? As we launched into this program, the first thing that we did really for the first few months was to conduct interviews. It was just listening to people's stories. So we worked with 48 frontliners, we're calling, so people who have experienced firsthand wildfire in the American West, including fire scientists. Mainly what we focused on was 30 rural residents, and that includes 8 pilot interviews. And Jack Kredell will talk a little bit more about the interview analyses that we've done on this. One really with the narrative team to look at significant aspects of narratives that appeared in these interviews. And then the second piece, right? How are people making meaning of fire or in these narratives, right? And what does story and the structure of story have to do with that meaning making? Go ahead, Jen. Yep. And we worked then in 5 different spaces, places, I guess, across the state, both in terms of parks and environmental education centers. And we trained in these places interpreters in fire narrative science programming so that they could deliver their own programs based on storytelling. And then simultaneously, our team conducted our own programs, developed our own program. We did about 12 over the summer and into the fall, all in all reaching over 200 participants in some of these programs. And I'll let Kayla talk a little bit more about some of the analysis that she's working on in terms of that programming, but I'll just highlight some of the projects or products that we're working on now as we're winding down on the project. We wrap up here in July on this, but one thing that I'll just note because it's exciting that happened in the last couple of weeks is that Jen led us and Lita Kobziar in a paper that just came out in the journal Fire on nostalgia and how nostalgia drives and derails living with wildfire in the American West. So with that, I'll turn over to Jack, and Jack will talk a little bit more about the interviews and the ways that we're working with those.
Yeah.
Okay, can you all see me? I think so. Can you hear me? My name is Jack Kredell. I started working on the project as a humanist, as a narrative scholar, and I've since become a first-year PhD student in environmental science. And so I've become kind of a bridge between these two worlds. And I'm going to talk about, as Teresa mentioned, some of the narrative trends that we observed in these stories. And so what do I mean by a narrative trend? I'm referring to both thematic and formal patterns in terms of how wildland fire is represented across diverse narrators. So how does wildland fire as it exists now in Idaho and in the Rocky Mountain West figure in human narration? What are its terms? How is it comprehended? And we found that the answer is, in many instances, is with great thematic and formal difficulty. One of the most common trends that we observed had to do with temporality. The temporal scale of fire and its effect on the landscape is often incommensurate with the temporal scales of human life and human narration or human experience. We tell stories about what happened last week, or a grandparent tells us a story from their childhood, maybe 7 years ago. But fire's return interval, its regime, especially in Rocky Mountain ecosystems, can extend to 100 or 200 years out. And so when fire does return, when it visits us, it's often met with shock and surprise. And so when it does appear after this long absence, and in the case of a stand replacement fire, which is what our first quote is referring to in Yellowstone in the late 80s, it changes the look of a forest for a very long time, and we call this ecological succession. And for a severe fire like the Yellowstone fires of 1988, a human life is coming to end just as the successional narrative is kind of reaching its intermission. And so the landscape through fire does not obey human timescales, and it becomes difficult to comprehend and to narrate. And it may even seem unnatural and evoke an emotional response related to that. And I think this is what we're seeing in Samuel's quote when he says, "Well, let it burn. It took 80 years to grow a tree. That's your whole life, you know." And Samuel's ire for the government here does not really mask what I think is a more complex emotional response to environmental change. The Yellowstone landscape that Samuel remembers won't return in his lifetime. And later in the interview, he expresses a sadness that his grandkids won't see the lush canopy forest as he once did. And so in this instance, fire produces a kind of poignant and narrative discontinuity. And then the second quote is from an interviewer that we're calling Xander. And this has to do more with the direct sensory experience of fire and how it leads to unpredictability and maybe even unreliability. Fire often behaves in ways that defies human possibility or experience, jumping rivers, smoldering underground for weeks, flying or spotting as gusting embers across valleys or mountainsides in a matter of minutes. And what is interesting about Xander's language is that he could be describing a superhero. It's the breakneck speed of fire is difficult to apprehend visually. It blurs present and past together. It's there and it's gone. Presence and absence become confused spatially as well. It's gone in the form of a raging inferno that's consuming his wheat crop, but it's also there in the form of the scorched wheat or the wheat stubble beneath his feet. And so fire's rejection of these binary terms, presence and absence, it's being chemically suffused across the landscape with different things, different materials, presents a huge, difficult problem for human narrativity, which relies so much on discreteness and being able to look at things and point at things and describe them in a kind of stable way, a stable environment. And fire kind of upends that. And then if you can go on to the next slide. The last quote I want to touch on is by an interviewee we're calling Laura from Brewster, Washington, and that's a photo of that fire, the Carlton Complex fire. And how am I on time? Am I close to 5 minutes? Probably. And so here, so with natural disasters, we often deal with the heartache and trauma by invoking a number of platitudes about the community coming together and what that means and how we got to know each other for the first time as a community through this disaster. And it almost kind of provides a kind of justification for it. And maybe that's true in some cases, but I think the more interesting thing that we observed here is that not knowing and rupture takes place. For Laura, it's the suspension of her accustomed epistemological ideas about the world and other people. They're suspended here by this object of fire. And so fire changes the way that we relate to other people and even ourselves. She says, what does she say? She says, I did not know them. I did not know them. I did not know them at all. But in a moment like that, it doesn't even matter. It's that her ideas of herself are suspended in this instance of fire. And it's actually that which is producing community. And so lastly, I'll just say that we expect narrative to communicate science, and we expect narrative to make sense of scientific phenomenon. But what I think we've learned here is that wildland fire is making the most sense scientifically and accurately in instances where narrative is becoming deranged or disturbed, where it's becoming unusual, when it becomes human in that way. And I'll leave it there in case we want to revisit the idea during the discussion, but I think fire is doing a lot to narrative, and it's very interesting for that reason. Thanks.
Next slide. Y'all seem so far away from this spot way back here. And hi, everyone on Zoom. You can see me okay? Great. Okay. Very nice. Okay. And then this is the camera. Awesome. Well, I'm just going to spend a few minutes talking about the framework that we're using to work with participant stories in these informal science learning settings that Teresa was mentioning, working in like state and national parks and their interpretive programming. And first, I'll give you a little rationale for why we think participant stories are such powerful tools for science learning. First, stories are just efficient. Humans are the storytelling species. We find stories easier to comprehend. We read them faster, and we remember more from stories than we do from expository information. So they're efficient for us for processing. Secondly, stories ground science in the everyday life experiences of participants. And we know that how we learn is by connecting past experiences and knowledge, so everything that we already know and have done and seen, to new information. So by asking participants for stories, we're actually facilitating that process. We're inviting that recall of their mental models of how the world works, right, through their stories. And then that offers us an opportunity to facilitate adding kind of new pieces of information. And I'll say too that it also helps the educator kind of visualize the mental models that participants are working from, so that we can help kind of situate new pieces of information. Third, it invites the reinterpretation of dominant narratives. So, you know, stories can be usual, right? Like we expect something to happen and it happens, okay? And we typically process those on autopilot. But stories can also surprise us. So they can offer kind of breaches in normalcy. And when those breaches happen, that moves us from autopilot into active processing or actively constructing knowledge. And so then we have opportunities to actually rethink some of the conceptual frameworks that we had in the past. And I think this can be particularly critical when we're thinking about these intractable issues like climate change. Gives us some opportunity for renewed thinking. And finally, participant stories in particular really challenge the norms of science learning spaces. So when a student or a learner, like a dad that's camping at Ponderosa State Park, walks into a science learning space, they have assumptions about whose expertise counts in that space and what types of knowledge are valid, right? Nancy, you're nodding your head. So when we flip the script and we say, no, actually, we're going to tell you a couple things, but mostly you're going to tell us stories. It's a huge shift in the power dynamics in that space, right? And we're saying you all have knowledge that's essential to us making meaning together, and also the fact that your knowledge comes in story form also matters, right? Because you're bringing emotional knowledge, cultural knowledge, social knowledge to bear on these issues, and all of that is valued and valid here. So it's a huge shift for science learning. And it's a shift that can increase motivation to learn for learners and also increase our agency. Let's go to the next slide, please. Thanks, Jen. Great. So I want to just show you really briefly this participatory storytelling approach that we are working on. And this is probably a new figure for the team even to see. I'm kind of playing with the model of it. But it basically has 5 components if you ignore the text on the right. So we have, see, I'm walking away from you guys.
We're just going to move the participants off.
Oh yeah, off
so we
the
can-
major conclusion. So in the participatory storytelling approach, there's 5 components. First is the container, right? We have to craft a space for storytelling. And we do that by incrementally increasing trust in the group, right? By starting with easy asks like, hey, how you doing? Share how your day is going. To bigger asks like, so what do we do about fire, right? So we have to kind of build up to that. We can also create that storytelling container by being explicit about these new rules of engagement, right? Because like today, you might expect to be a passive audience member, but if I came in and said, hey, I actually want to hear from you, that would at least give you a signal for what type of space that you're in. So that we call it scaffolding, and that's part of building that storytelling container. The second component is the educator content. Those are the science nuggets. That's kind of the traditional stuff that we're bringing to the table. In our programs this summer, it was like fire history of this particular place, changes to fire patterns in the place, and current fire management. So those are the nuggets that we're adding to this conversation. Then we have the participant stories. So we're prompting them for lived experiences of fire or of themes related to fire that we can draw on to kind of understand this complex phenomenon. And then we have this connection and validation. I'd say this is kind of the crux of the model because it's hard to do, but this is where the educator draws connections between the stories that we're told and the larger scientific context and the stories that we're told on each other, right? So we're bringing those together. And the validation is saying the knowledge embedded in your story matters here. And finally, that can lead us to these co-created insights. This is like the goal of the program, right? To generate conclusions together. I'd like to run through a quick example. Would that be okay, team? Okay, thumbs up, sweet. All right, so this is an example in practice, just so you can see this, how this works. So in a program at Ponderosa State Park this summer, we were looking at a program about how to adapt to living with more fire in that particular place. And the educator content was, as I said, changes to the fire patterns in the state park. So then we move into the storytelling phase, and the educator says, okay, turn to a neighbor and share a story about fire. So we say turn to a neighbor because it's safer for someone to tell one person than to shout out their story to the whole group, right? So everyone tells little stories, And then we invite volunteers to share out with the group. And this is an example of one participant story that night. She came from Florida. And I'm going to step over here. Oh, I can't see it there either. But she said, in Florida, fire's all low, not very hot, burning grasses. It's not something we see and quake in our boots. When we're driving, we see fires smoldering along the roadside, but it's normal. Okay, next slide. Thanks, Jen. So we hear this story, the group hears this story, and this is where the educator has a moment to connect and validate. So they say that night, they said, wow, it's great to have knowledge from another region with us tonight. So there's the validation. In the Southeast, where this woman is from, right? Those ground level controlled burns are really common. While out West, we're not as accustomed to seeing regular burns where we live. Even though, just as we talked about, lots of low intensity fire is natural here too. So she's drawing connections between that story and the larger frame, and this kind of place-based science story we're creating together. A few other people share their stories, and then the interpreter moves into this co-creation of insights phase. And she says, so what might we learn from all these stories, from everything that's in the hopper, right? All these stories about how to relate differently to fire here. And the responses that night were so cool. The first person said, well, I never really appreciated the controlled burns, but if we have numerous low burns, it could be safer. So to me, there's that shift in knowledge, right? Or shift in perspective. They're saying, I never really appreciate it. So they're like changing their mind somehow. And they're thinking about controlled burning, which is one of the primary tools that we have to restore our historical fire regimes. They're thinking about controlled burning in a new way, that it could be safer. The second person said, it's the impact that human beings have, not just in towns, but in places like out here. We're interrupting the natural flow of things. This one really blew my mind because this is actually about a fundamental shift in kind of the perspective of humans relating to fire, right? So the dominant narrative is that fire is intruding more and more on human communities. And this person is saying like, whoa, maybe we're the intruders. So that's, I don't know, that was a really big, profound shift in thinking. And finally, someone said, it's not always a destructive force per se, it's part of the natural cycle of things. So there's this acknowledgement that, oh, like fire is actually kind of natural normal here. So it's a normalizing of fire. So I could talk about this for hours and hours. I love this stuff. If any of you think that this might be relevant to the types of science communication work that you do, and you would like to explore using your students or participants' stories, feel free to reach out to any of us, or me in particular, after the program. Thanks, and I'll pass it to Erin, I think.
Thanks, Kayla. Can everyone hear me okay in the room?
Yes.
Okay, all right. I'm going to switch gears a little bit here, and we're going to shift to a different kind of project. And you can think about this initiative that Jen and I are going to talk about now, which we call narrative science, or we're calling narrative science, as something that is growing out of the Stories of Fire project and kind of developing alongside of it. And I think really the impetus for this was conversations that the full team was having, and particularly Jen and I coming from as faculty from English, and Kayla and Teresa as people who were more trained in science communication, and the four of us just looking at each other and going, wait, what? What? So I have on this slide here 4 different definitions of narrative that are pretty familiar to me as someone who's working in narratology and narrative theory, right? And the reason why I think they're so interesting is because they are quite different from the definitions of narrative that Teresa and Kayla would have been familiar with that float around in science communication. I've listed these definitions in chronological order. We can kind of talk about them in more detail if we like during the Q&A, but just quickly, right? They're pretty specific. So the earliest one from Gerard Jeanette in the 1970s, he defines narrative as the representation of an event or a sequence of events. This is a pretty tight emphasis on temporal sequence, right? That things are happening in time. The second definition, which is the driest, is from Gerald Prince in the 1980s. He defines narrative as the representation of one or more real or fictive events communicated by one, two, or several narrators to one, two, or several narratees. So we have a new layer here, right? I like to think of this almost, the development of these definitions almost as like nested dolls, right? So we have this sequence of events, but now we have this extra component, which is that you have a speaking agent or a narrator and a receiving agent or a narratee. So someone's telling a story to someone else. The third definition is my favorite just because it's so cute. This is James Phelan's definition from the 1990s. A narrative is somebody telling someone else on some occasion and for some purpose that something happened. Here we maintain those first two elements of something happening and someone telling someone else, but now we have for a purpose. We begin to understand narratives as tools of persuasion, right? Not simply tools of communication, but tools of persuasion. And then the most recent one from David Herman, which is about 20 years old now, talks about narrative as having four basic elements. Situatedness, so this is a speaking agent telling a story to a receiving agent for some reason in some context. We have event sequencing, things happen over time. World making, these events happen in a world. Characters in a narrative function in some sort of world, and the narrative helps to create that world for both the speaker and the receiver. And then Herman draws on this concept, which has become really important to us, which is qualia. Qualia we can think of as being sensory information. It's a kind of representation of consciousness. It's a representation of what it's like to experience this world in flux. So Jen, if you can flip to the next slide. So if you compare those definitions to the definitions of narrative that tend to circulate in science communication, this first one is from Michael Dahlstrom's work. He says that narrative follows a particular structure that describes the cause and effect relationships between events that take place over a particular time period and that impact particular characters. It's a really tight emphasis on time, right? We don't have this broader context of what it's like, of qualia, of a world, right? And then the second one here is from Randy Olson. He defines narrative as a series of events that happen along the way in the search for a solution to a problem. And elsewhere, he writes that narrative unifies a bunch of seemingly disparate pieces of information and that the central element in a story is time. Again, Jen and I read these definitions and think, wow, these are pretty limited ways of understanding what stories and narratives are. And our kind of hypothesis here is that this really limited understanding of what a story is leads to a quite myopic understanding of what a story can do. So for example, Olson, who is talking pretty powerfully about the need for storytelling in science, reduces all of this down to a really simple formula, which he prescribes as the ABT framework, which he says, okay, when you're writing your scientific abstract or paper, use the word and in your first sentence, but in the second sentence, and therefore in your third sentence. And Jenna and I like recoil at this, right? Because we think, oh my God, all of the juice has fallen out of narrative. Like this isn't even a narrative, what you're prescribing, right? So we had this kind of pretty intense confusion. Okay, Jen, now you can go to the next slide, please. So we began to realize that if we look at the four different building blocks of narrative, which we're simplifying as characters, so who or what exists in the story, who tells the story, why does the teller tell the story and to whom? Events, what is the time course of particularized events? World, in what kind of world or what we would call a story world do these events take place? And then what it's like, sensory information. What's the experience of living through this world in flux? We realize that a lot of scientific discourse, and importantly, discussions of how to use narrative in producing scientific discourse, are really solid on two of these building blocks. So Jen, if you can go to the next slide. They're really great at communicating events that take place in a world, but out of that kind of articulation of science drops these other two building blocks of narrative, which are characters and what it's like. When you read scientific articles, right? Or when you listen to, I'm creating a kind of straw person argument here, but bear with me. When you listen to a scientist talking about their work, right? They tend to not give you a lot of information of characters, so much so that in very traditional kind of stereotypical scientific discourse, we don't even use the first person pronoun, right? We express everything in a passive voice to kind of scrub
our discussion of science, if any active agents that are actually doing the science, right? And there's really, really scant descriptions of what it was like, particularly what it was like for the scientists to do the science. What sort of emotions did you have as you were doing this? What sort of kind of sensory information did you gather? So we've decided, or we've kind of begun to build out this new approach, which we're calling narrative science. Jen, if you can switch to the next slide. So I'm going to give you a couple of visual metaphors here to kind of draw distinctions between what we're exploring and how narrative tends to kind of circulate in scientific discourse. The first metaphor that I'll give you is someone pouring water into a glass, right? And we tend to think of that this is how narrative tends to function in scientific discourse right now, right? So you do your science and it's here. And then at the very last stage, before you disseminate that to the public, you pour it into a container. This is a different container than the one that Kayla was talking about, right? But you pour it into the narrative container. This is like a process of translation where you make your science palatable for a broader public. Narrative appears only at the end stage, and it only has to do with communication, right? You are just communicating this in a specific way so as to take advantage of these benefits of narrative. What we call narrative science is incredibly different. And we think about this as a process of restorying. So we see story as present in all stages of science, especially hypothesis generation, right? When scientists are generating hypotheses, there are characters, there's a world, there are events that they're anticipating is going to take place. They're driven by a sense of what it's like or what it might be like, right, for these events to take place. The metaphor that I'll give you here is almost akin to art restoration, right? Is that we're going back to the original conceptualization of a project and scrubbing away the limitations that have been placed upon it by kind of, conformity to scientific discourse to expose the kind of richness of what was there to begin with, right? So what this means in practice is that we're really interested in working with scientists to speak more openly, right, about characters and what it's like in articulations of their work, in addition to worlds and events, but also appreciate that science and narrative are not two things that are inherently separate, in which you have to translate one to fit into the other. They're part of the same process of cognition, right? They're part of the same process of understanding our world. And if we don't oppose them, we can become much more bold and adventurous with what narrative and science might do together. So just one more slide here, and then I'm going to hand over to Jen. One of the reasons that we're so kind of pushing, right, on the use of narrative in all parts of science is because of what Kayla was talking about earlier, right? Which suggests that your brain functions inherently differently when it's on narrative as opposed to when it's on other forms of communication. I always feel like I'm dating myself a little bit, but some of you in the audience might remember that old anti-drug commercial with the guy had an egg in a frying pan, right? And he said, this is your egg, and he cracks the egg and begins to sizzle. And he says, this is your egg, this is your brain, right? And it sizzles, and he says, this is your brain on drugs. You can think about cognitive narratologists as doing the very same thing with narrative instead of drugs, right? So like actually looking at what happens in brains when they are interpreting narrative. This involves putting undergrads through fMRI machines, right? Doing eye tracking surveys, doing pre and post reading surveys. And what we're finding is that your brain makes very little, if any, distinction between reading about an experience and encountering that experience in real life. In other words, interpreting a narrative, listening, reading, watching a narrative is a simulative process in which you are running a simulation of those events in your head, right? And there are lots and lots of studies now in cognitive science which suggest that you would, if you are reading or listening to a narrative, dynamically activate specific parts of your brain, which would fire in real life if you were going to do these actions when you're reading a narrative. And this has really important connotations for our emotional kind of landscapes, which I'm going to hand over to Jen now to talk to you about.
Great, thanks, Erin. And thanks, everyone. It's good to be here sort of with all of you today. Thanks to Jack and Kayla for being in the room and speaking so eloquently about the project. I'm really excited to be part of this team. We've made a lot of progress and some really interesting discoveries over the last couple of years. I'm going to talk about the emotion piece of this. This is kind of my area of expertise, and it's been part of the project from the very beginning, from the proposal phase. Emotions, as we know, are these complex collections of chemical and neural responses. They form patterns in our brain that we can see in these fMRI machines. They help regulate our behavior, serving these evolutionary functions, right? They're often talked about in a basic sense. And the images on the left here that Paul Ekman, the psychologist, sort of made famous, suggest, facial recognition as part of understanding emotions. But more recently, the sort of Western science of emotions has made things even more complex. You can see my reference to Lisa Feldman Barrett's work, How Emotions Are Made, The Secret Life of the Brain. She comes up with a sort of theory of constructed emotion that's much more complicated. And you can see the emotion wheel, one of many that's available on the right that lends a much richer vocabulary to our emotional or affective lives. We have found on our project team that emotions are indeed quite complicated, and they come up in sometimes surprising and intense ways when you ask people to tell stories about fire. We've seen a lot of emotionality in the interviews. Jack mentioned, some of the shock and surprise that comes through in some of these personal stories. It's not surprising to think that fire stories would be highly emotional, right? But they do tend to come up with things like fear, grief, all sorts of emotions on this wheel or this kind of spectrum, much more complicated than the 6 sort of basic ones that you see on the left. And Teresa gave a shout out to our very recent article on nostalgia. This was a really fun piece to work on, and I want to thank Lita Kobziar in particular for her leadership on this. But we looked at nostalgic representations of fire in news media and film mostly. We looked at things like the giant sequoia, representations of the sort of heroic firefighter fighting the good fight, and a couple other sort of nostalgic figures. And we looked at how those circulate in news and news media. And we argue, among other things, for a kind of what we call affective agility, or a kind of emotional resilience that should be evolving with our changing relationships to wildfire. So I encourage you to check it out. It's open access, so everyone should download it and read it. It was super fun. But it's really just the latest in this kind of broader effort to understand how emotions are not just part of science education and sort of learning in particular, but also part of the scientific process itself. And I'm going to try to focus in the short time I have on the kind of narrative science end of things, which Erin set me up nicely to do. I do want to give a quick nod to some of the work I've been fortunate to do with Kayla and some informal educators around the state. We've done a couple of workshops now where we talk about emotions in science education contexts. Kayla invited me to partner with her on a workshop in Boise, and we came up with a few different ways that we think emotions are assets to science learning. So I'll just leave this slide up here for a minute. I'm not going to talk through it in much depth though, but basically emotions help make science resonant. They're complex. They might lead to pro-social behaviors through the kind of connectivity that emotions inspire. Kayla and I are happy to share our tips and tricks too. We developed quite a few sort of interactive learning activities that center emotion in science learning. One of the things we enjoyed was this emotion audit, something anyone can do in their own learning environments, but thinking about not just intellectual goals that we have for learners and participants in our learning communities, but also emotional goals. And it's important, I think, to be sort of deliberate and strategic about some of those. And you can think about even things like your classroom atmosphere, a trajectory for the emotional content in your class. How do you want to end things, for example, as we wrap up the spring semester, allowing time to process feelings as they arise. But what I'm going to focus on in the time I have left is the sort of narrative science piece. And so as Erin was saying, we think of this restoring or sort of restoration process in which narrative and emotion are present in science from the beginning and at different kinds of stages. So we'd like to challenge the idea that science is objective and sort of free of emotion. We suspect that really no learning or research space is entirely neutral or objective, and that, again, emotions are present, right? You've got the aha moments. You've got the initial curiosity and wonder that comes in as you're discovering things and posing questions. You might have disappointment that comes along with failure. And we think we can help scientists and science communicators tap into those emotional dimensions of science and maybe harness them for more impactful data representation and more compelling stories. We're inspired by scientists such as the two on your screen here, Dr. Peter Kalmus, who actually visited us on Friday via Zoom and told some very compelling stories about his own work, and Dr. Catherine Hayhoe. who recommends we start from the heart and we help identify common ground, such as shared objects of care with other people to begin dealing with climate change. We're not the first ones or the only ones to notice that scientists have emotions, of course. Researcher Susan Clayton has been tracking this in her "Is This How You Feel" study. You can see a wide range of emotions that climate scientists in particular have articulated in terms of how they feel about their research. If you want to look up Dr. Kalmus's direct action event as of April 6th, he handcuffed himself to a bank door and gave a very emotional speech about why he felt impelled to do these kinds of things rather than just publishing scientific reports, which he's been doing for decades now. But maybe some of you have seen the film Don't Look Up. This is the PG version of the "We're All Gonna Die." Maybe Erin has her water bottle sticker. But anyway, this is a recent film that speaks to the need to listen to scientists, to trust scientists, and the frustration that scientists feel when that doesn't happen. Let's see. One of the things we think about when we think about emotions in narrative and narrative science is that every research problem, every scientific problem has a narrative frame, either explicit or implicit, and that those frames have emotional or affective dimensions to them. You can think, immediately of a sort of catastrophic frame and some of the sort of fearful emotions that can inspire in people. Some research has suggested that a public health frame for climate change is actually inspirational in terms of making people feel hope and efficacy among a range of audiences. If you want to think about economic frames, you could turn to the McClure Center in Boise. They gave a presentation a few weeks ago now, I think. Some of you might have been there. They focus on the climate economic impacts in the state of Idaho, right? So you can think about some of these other frames as well. And we think about things like the qualia, the what it's likeness that Erin mentioned before. Those multi-sensory cues in science and in science writing, I think, are really important for conveying data in ways that are emotionally resonant and compelling and actually help people learn better, right? Emotions aid cognition. Qualia, this sense of what it's like, can trigger emotional responses in learning. And we think about like the arc of narratives, right? Do we want to end with hope, for example? So often environmental problems are framed as sort of hope or despair, right? But there's this whole rich, terrain in between those two things and all around. And so we think about things like outrage or grief or worry or wonder and curiosity, right? Depending on the audience, different frames could produce better or worse results. So just last slide here to recap, emotions are always present. There's no neutral learning space or research space. And that's a good thing, right? Emotions are an asset, not a liability. And there are many ways we can do better at kind of normalizing the presence of emotions in science spaces and maybe sort of harnessing them more effectively. I do have one more slide, and this is a couple of photos that Lita Kobziar shared with us the other day. We're really excited to see what new shapes this team and our project takes in the future, and we are planning to apply for the next phase of an ACEL grant. We're going to be brainstorming this summer to put a finer point on what that's going to look like, but we're super excited about it. Lita adds in the photo on the right, I'm not sure if you all can read this, it strikes me that whenever we are on a fire, we form circles to communicate, never a bunch with one person in front. I really thought that was a nice note to end on. And I do invite you to join our Confluence Lab listserv. You can send me an email if you'd like to be added to see what we're up to and what events are coming up. Thanks, everyone. I'll stop there and have some time for Q&A.
Well, thank you, Jen and team, for a truly interdisciplinary presentation, and wonderful to have so many perspectives represented. And I think we can turn to questions first here in the classroom in the admin building, a question or comment, and then to those participating remotely. So first, anyone here? So Nancy, yes, please.
About your name, Taylor?
Oh, Jack.
Jack.
Yeah.
One of your last comments was that, and I'm paraphrasing, so you can correct me, but fire has changed narratives. What was that you?
Deranged.
Deranged. So, thank you. Is there another phenomenon out there that you also see having that same sort of impact on the narrative that fire has had?
It's an environmental phenomenon.
Maybe not. I was thinking environmental, but since you're looking at this shift in narrative because of fire, is there something out there literature-wise that you're aware of, the other things that you could point to the same level of disruption or derangement?
Yeah, I'm nothing's coming to mind immediately, but I think climate change is the kind of phenomenon that, in terms of its communication, would benefit from a kind of more local and human derangement in terms of it being part of our everyday experience and how it affects the larger environment beyond an individual. Yeah, so I think awareness of something as massive in scale as climate change could definitely benefit.
So maybe a subset of that would be individual parts of climate change, like a sudden event like fire.
Right, and just making the global local, which sounds nice, in theory, but in practice, it could be quite devastating and strange,
Thank you.
Can I just add,
Yes, go ahead. Erin.
Yeah, and Nancy, I think this is a great question. I think Jack's spot on to link this to climate change. One of the reasons that our team is so excited to work on fire is because it is, it's sometimes easier to talk about than climate change, because it is, ironically, given what Jack has told us, it feels like you can get your mind around it and see it and experience it in a way that climate change just feels a little bit more abstract. But for me personally, I think a lot of the narrative derangement, right, that Jack is talking about with fire is a microcosm of a much broader discussion about climate change and narrative. And there's a whole bunch of scholarship out there about this newish genre of text called cli-fi, or climate change fiction. And some of the narrative innovations that writers are developing to represent climate change. And then even a kind of broader conversation of whether narrative is capable of representing climate change at all, given the kind of evolutionary timeframes, planetary spacescapes, kind of non-human perspectives that we tend to affiliate with a kind of robust representation of climate change. And Jen's given me very kindly a plug in the chat, but I've got a book coming out in 2 days about this topic, so I could talk more about it if you'd like at a later time.
Thank you.
Another question in the classroom from Will, please go ahead.
Wouldn't narrative disruptions be also come from writing about the pandemic? Same kind of catastrophe, in some respects, we're unable to get our arms around it, more like climate change, we're unable to get our arms around it and see it. But the pandemics, this one and future ones.
Completely. I mean, the commitment to a mask is for this invisible other person that you don't have experience of, and yet you do it for their sake, and in that sense it's a very abstract thing to follow through on, but we nonetheless do it, because we believe in community and the efficacy of science. But you're right, though, it's also kind of strange that we are committing to someone that we can't experience locally.
I was going to elaborate on that same thing, and I'm a geologist, so any natural disasters to me were tragic. I watched a deal on this tsunami that hit the Indonesian coast here about 10 years ago. There were 250,000 people killed in that. That's 500,000 people, or 250,000 people, excuse me for my math.
Yeah, I think
But any of those make a very vivid memory in my mind.
Yeah.
I will remember that forever, because I remember when it happened. The earthquake in Mackay, the Mount St. Helens explosion. A good friend of mine was killed on that. that makes all the difference in the world in my life. For every natural disaster that happened after that, I used to think it was kind of the earth kind of shrugging their shoulders, but when a loved one is lost on that mountain, then it's real. And you know that every one of those 250,000 people that lost their lives in tsunamis had loved ones that lived through it that were affected for the rest of their life because of it. That's huge amounts of.
I'm not sure whether the Zoom audience heard all of those comments about the emotional disruption or derangement created by the pandemic, as Will mentioned, or natural disasters such as tsunamis, volcanoes, and earthquakes, as mentioned by Bill. I wanted to go to Jen. Do you want to respond to?
Oh,
to
just
that?
yeah, really quickly. Hearing Jack and others talking about the pandemic and making these connections to climate change just made me want to say that one of the things we've really enjoyed with working with fire and collecting these stories of fire is that it's an elemental phenomenon, right? And it is different than something like climate change or wearing a mask or not wearing a mask, insofar that it's not as polarizing. It doesn't tend to trigger the same kinds of polarized responses that talking about something like climate change risks doing, right? Especially in certain rural communities. So we've really enjoyed it, and we're going to stick with fire. It's a really fascinating sort of boundary object to talk about. So that's it. Go ahead, Kenton.
So Dan has a hand up here in the classroom. A kind of question or comment? And
do any of you have favorite fire stories or favorite fire literature?
Favorite fire stories or favorite literature? Fiction, nonfiction?
Whatever.
Whatever.
That's a great question, and I want to like throw it out to everyone because I'm teaching a course in the fall called Stories of Fire. That's going to be about fire narratives. I will just flag a recent book that I read called Something New Under the Sun by Alexandra Kleeman, which is not, there's a big fire in it, but it's not like, you know, Young Men and Fire, like obviously about fire in that way. But it's a kind of noir cli-fi story. And it really nicely illustrates both the dread of a kind of ever-present looming fire, and then the catastrophic kind of fire that can destroy things in seconds. And so that was a kind of pretty interesting take on fire that I've read recently. But I'd love to hear what others have to say.
Norman MacLean wrote the book, The Young Men and Fire, but he has another group of essays, A River Runs Through It, and in there is a story about him as he stayed in a fire lookout on the Idaho-Montana border, and it's quite a dramatic story of his summer in the mountains.
So Will mentioned Norman MacLean's book, A River Runs Through It. Has an episode about a summer in a fire camp on the Idaho-Montana border. Other questions or comments from the Zoom audience? Would any of the panelists like to respond to something you heard or something that wasn't said? We can go a little past 1:30 here if anyone has additional observations. Teresa has offered in the chat T.S. Eliot, 4 quartets, Stephen Pine, anything, and a film called Bring Your Own Brigade. Looking forward to learning more about that film. And Jen earlier put the Guardian article that inspired the use of deranged, how fires across the world have gone weirder. And perhaps for those who don't have access to the chat right now, Jen, if you could send me that link as an email, and I'll share it.
Sure.
Very good. Yes, thank you, Bethany, for that comment. In speaking with people, what have they expressed needing, that is in terms of how to handle preparedness for fire? Any one of the team want to respond to that point about needs of participants when they are telling fire stories? Kayla, do you
I
want?
can start. Yeah, thanks for the question, Bethany. So our work isn't necessarily in kind of the management world. So we're not in these communities looking for kind of like next steps in terms of fire management, but a lot of different ideas about how they might adapt to changing fire patterns emerge. And in terms of what they need, one thing that we're noticing is that the interviewees positioned themselves as really able, like they have a lot of agency. They're able to change local dynamics using the resources that they have available to them. They really, I would say, kind of narrate the causes of fire on a local scale, which is different than how science typically positions the causes of changing patterns of fire at more of a regional or sometimes global scale. But participants really stuck to these local contextual issues, like the once in a 100-year wind that came through their community, or the particular fuel composition in their front yard, you know, and the impact that made. So they really haven't expressed a lot of external need, but rather more agency in terms of what they want to do, which often is things that they can control, which is right around their house. So they'll say, you know, we, since the fire, you better believe we don't have any wood close to the house, and you better believe that we have defensible space out to 100 yards, or things like that. They also talk about actions that they have done or will do on behalf of other community members, but it's often framed in that really kind of agency-oriented way, as opposed to needs. Does anyone else want to add thoughts on that?
I think we're at a good stopping point. So thank you to our team members today and to our audience, both in person and on Zoom. And if I could ask the audience to put up a hand in chat or make an fascinating presentation. We'll check in with you in a year maybe and see what else you've learned about these stories of fire. I hope that you will now turn your attention this Thursday to stories of soil. And that's 4:30 over in the Ag Science Building, room 106. And next Tuesday, 1 week from today, May the 3rd, we will be at the Arboretum for a tour, and that will wrap up the spring semester series of the colloquium. So thank you everyone for being here. Enjoy these moments of spring as they appear, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks a lot, Kenton. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.